Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I see some familiar names from last time. It's nice to see you again. We'll get started in just a minute or two here. We'll let people join. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Well, again, good morning, everyone. As I said, it's so nice to see some of you from part 2, which a couple weeks ago, as well as some new names and faces this morning. We welcome you. My name is Adia Linouts. I'm the Director of Programs here at FPWA. And I'll be joined by Wenimo Okoya today, who is the founder and executive director of the Healing Schools Project, and she'll do the grand majority of the presenting today. I'm just going to do a few intro slides, and then I'll pass it over to Wenimo. So give me just a moment. I'll share my screen. Okay. So again, this series is called 2 Years in Leadership and Recovery in Times of COVID-19. This is part 3 of the 3-part series, building a culture of community care and prioritizing employee well-being. Just real quick, a little bit about FPWA. FPWA is an anti-poverty policy and advocacy organization with a membership network of over 170 human services and faith-based organizations. We promote the social and economic well-being of individuals and communities by advocating for just public policies, as well as strengthening human services organizations. And more specifically in that realm, really working on strengthening the capacity of human service organizations to begin taking a trauma-informed and people-centered approach to both their internal operations as well as service delivery. So quick couple points about this series. Again, 2 years into the pandemic, we know that it's nonprofits primarily that are continuing to provide high levels of support to both individuals and communities that have been hardest hit by the pandemic. This 3-part series aims to address some of the most common challenges and stressors that we've all experienced. For those of you who are in part 1, we spoke about sort of ensuring financial stability for organizations throughout this time. I think May 12th was the right date for part 2, and we talked about trying to lead and manage through change. I think all nonprofits, across the sector have seen a lot of turnover, and how do you, just changing rules and landscapes, and so how do you continue to lead and manage during all of that? And then finally today, we're going to focus on, like we said, employee well-being. So how do you build an organization that prioritizes employee well-being and builds a culture of community care? So how do we start avoiding the burnout, the compassion fatigue, all of that comes, especially 2 years into the pandemic and doing work that is very difficult day to day? Before I turn it over, I'm just going to go through a couple housekeeping items here. First, again, we encourage participation, so please do feel free to use the chat function, the reaction buttons, or unmute at certain times to let us know what your questions are, what your thoughts are, and join in the conversation. Right after the presentation, as well as in the follow-up email, you'll be receiving a post-survey link. It's only 4 questions, multiple choice, so please take a moment to fill that out and let us know what you thought of this session, and it really helps us understand what we should offer more of in the future in terms of capacity building. And finally, in that follow-up email that I mentioned, we will provide the PowerPoint slides, other resources. There will be a recording of this, so you'll have all the links and resources that you need at the end. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will hand it over to Wenimo Okoya to introduce herself and get us going today. So good morning, Wenimo.
Okay. I am like trying to master driving. Cars. It feels like unmuting and sharing screen are 2 different cars. So it's all good. You can just see the one screen.
Yep, you're good.
Yeah. All right. So thank you so much for having me here. Really excited to talk about this topic and to learn a little bit about your organizations. As we get started, and we always start off our sessions like this, just check in with yourself and what you need. So if you need a bio break, or if you need to grab some more water or tea or coffee, or like me, some ginger chews because my stomach is giving me some trouble this morning. Check in with yourself if you haven't done that today. Take a few deep breaths to get yourself settled. And if you can, and I know there's a lot going on in the world and in our lives, just decrease minimize the other tabs that you have on your screen and try to be present in this moment. Grab a notebook if you need one, and stand up and stretch. So just figure out what you might need and think about checking in like that throughout the session today. So, oh, wait, let me introduce myself a little bit. I can do it on this slide. So I'm, my name is Wenimo Okoya. I'm the founder and executive director of Healing Schools Project. We're a very new organization, but we focus on the healing and well-being of educators. And our mission is that we heal teachers so they can heal their students. My background is as a classroom teacher, and I left the classroom to pursue a master's of public health and my doctorate's in health education. And I've done a lot of research and program building, training around building and training folks to do trauma sensitive work with schools and with systems. So I've worked with a number of nonprofits, worked with school systems, and have really found that for a long time, we were skipping over the folks that were giving support to underserved communities to get to the needs. So in our case, skipping over students to get to skipping over teachers to get to students. In homeless shelters, skipping over the homeless liaisons to make sure that students living in temporary housing were getting the support that they need. And in your cases, excuse me, I'm sure your experiences are really similar. So I think that something that COVID has done has made us super aware of the need for prioritizing the well-being of the people who are frontline, even the folks that are distal to that and absorbing a lot of secondary trauma and also experiencing their own trauma. So our mission is really to make sure that schools are centers of healing, where all can learn, thrive, and grow. And I hope that your workplaces, you kind of come away with a vision that your workplaces can be centers of healing as well. So that's kind of the what we're trying to walk away with today is a mindset around making sure that if we're doing this really important work, that our workplaces can be places of healing and support, because we spend so much time there. It really just makes sense. I'd love if folks could introduce themselves in the chat, and you don't have to say your name because it's in there. But if you could share what your role is, your organization, and what brings you to the session, and then we can read that and just know who else is in the room. So let's get going. So here are objectives.
Sorry, I didn't realize it's in the chat. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Thank you. So here are objectives for today. So we're going to define community care. I call it co-care for short. Reflect on identity and how context, our needs and practices, identity and context, and how that impacts our needs, practices, and experiences, and identify the conditions we need for a culture towards healing through community care. So here are just some working agreements, and we'll do some breakout groups, and we might share a whole group as well, but I like to start with some working agreements to make sure that this is a brave space for everyone. So try to practice deep listening, speak and listen from the heart, lean into discomfort, welcome feedback as a gift, take learning, but leave the story. So, sometimes when people share things here, it violates confidentiality because we take people's stories and use them as our own. So take the learning, but leave the story. Accept non-closure, take space or make space. If you're usually someone who sits back, push yourself to lean forward. If you're usually someone who takes up a lot of verbal space, reflect and leave room for those quieter voices. And if there is a harm done, the order of the speaker should be the person harmed, then others affected, then others on the team. So those are our ground rules. So if anyone would like to add any other ground rules that they need in order to make sure that this space is brave and safe for them, we can definitely add those, and I will make sure that I'm the upholder of those ground rules for us. So I'm just kind of scrolling through the chat to see who's here. Hope program, welcome. Awesome. Partnerships at Co-op Careers. All FPWA folks here. Great. United Activities Unlimited. Great. Awesome. CHLDC's Fun and Wellness Community. Ooh, I like that you lead with fun. That's awesome. I'm glad that you have that. I've not heard of that any other organization. So welcome, and if folks can continue to share who you are, awesome. CFO here. So if folks can continue to share who you are so that we all know who's in the room, that would be great. And feel free to add any other agreements that you need throughout the session. This is not your only chance to do that. So I want you to just take a second, and I want to start with this because so many of us haven't done this. We're not actually going to do this in a poll because there are so few of us. We're going to do this. You can do it on paper, or you can do it in the chat if you're comfortable sharing. Let's skip the first section because I took the poll out. But how does it feel to, in the beginning, when I asked you to think about what you needed to feel supported and what you needed for the session? What did it feel like to take a moment? And if you didn't do that, if you kind of skipped over that because it was like, that's something that's on the slide, take a moment and do that right now. So think about what you need to feel supported. And then explain and sort of share with us, or reflect if you don't feel comfortable, how it feels to be asked what you need to be supported. So Jennifer sharing that it was nice to pause and do that, refreshing. Surprising, interesting win. Welcoming. Centering. Great. And notice it didn't take any time for me to just remind y'all to do that in the beginning. And a little bit of what I'm trying to do during this session is model some quick things that you can do at the beginning of a staff meeting, at the beginning of a check-in that you have, just to make your employees feel seen, and that you can do that for each other. So just those like simple, tiny things that we can do at the beginning of a session to make sure that people feel seen and heard and centered and welcomed into the space, all the words that you described. And for me as a facilitator, it felt good for me to shape the space in that way, to make sure that I know that the people there, regardless of how well they know me, know that this is a space where they can take what they need. So now I'm going to jump into the content a little bit. So I'm sure that all of you are familiar with trauma, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, but I'm going to break down a couple different types of trauma and some terms that I think are important for us to differentiate, because oftentimes they're kind of lumped together. A colleague of mine, Kathleen Ambiela, calls it bacon, egg, and cheesing. Like we kind of just like blend words and terms together, like you do when you go to a bodega in New York City, like I'll get a bacon, egg, and cheese. So like I want to break it apart. So primary trauma is something that happens to us. In the adverse childhood experiences, they're in the categories of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And those are the ones that the research points to in the ACEs study. We know that the more adverse childhood experiences one has, the worse their health outcomes, higher risk-taking behavior, emotional well-being, etc. And then I like this one to include this one as well. That includes the kind of the root causes, these adverse community environments and the context that folks are living in, include poverty, violence, racial discrimination, etc. Not just necessarily the manifestations of those things, but acknowledge that there are structural issues at play that make these issues rise to the top. So primary trauma is when we experience trauma ourselves, right? Then we've got secondary trauma and compassion fatigue, which are often, and then burnout, right? Which are three other words. We often say like trauma, burnout, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue. We just like bacon, egg, and cheese it all together, right? But I actually want to break it down a little bit. So secondary trauma is synonymous with vicarious trauma, So secondary trauma is when we are working with people who've experienced trauma and then we absorb their trauma as our own. And the impacts of secondary trauma can look a lot like the manifestations of primary trauma. Then there's compassion fatigue, which is simply put when we are in fields where we have to show an extreme amount of compassion, and there are a few boundaries around how much compassion we can show. So the way we prevent compassion fatigue is by setting boundaries and having high expectations. Secondary trauma is sort of inevitable. So what we want to prevent, or what we really want to address, is the compassion fatigue, and we want to intervene on the secondary trauma. I'm going to talk about how we can do both of those things. And then kind of the confluence of those two things is burnout. And actually burnout we need to prevent, because once burnout happens, it's very hard to turn it around. Once one's burnt out, they either have to sort of choose to stay in the field and be disgruntled and just kind of be like an unhappy employee, or they leave the profession or find another role. So burnout is, I don't want to say irreversible, but really, really difficult to reverse, while secondary trauma and compassion fatigue we can intervene on. So that's where I want to focus on today. And when we're thinking about prioritizing well-being, we're focusing on burnout prevention, not treating burnout. Burnout treatment would require a clinical intervention, and would be really difficult to do in the workplace. Another term that kind of gets thrown in there is toxic stress. And toxic stress is not synonymous with trauma. So there are three types of stress that Jack Schonberg talks about, and he's coined this phrase, toxic stress. There's positive stress, which is what I'm feeling right now. My heart rate's elevated. I'm excited to talk about this topic with people who are passionate about it. You're sort of a captive audience. And that stress is helping me to get through this presentation. There's tolerable stress, which is like what I was experiencing this morning, where I was like pretty tired. I've been sick a little bit lately, but my partner helped me to prep in the morning. So I had some supportive relationship to help me get through that stress. Toxic stress is when we have stress that is prolonged, and or we don't have protective relationships to help us through that. So if you notice, the difference between tolerable and toxic stress is relationship and connection. And we've never in probably our lifetimes had an experience of such isolation before. So the pandemic has increased our susceptibility to toxic stress because we have less access to supportive relationships. So in this moment, we really need to beef up the connection and beef up our opportunities for building protective relationships and accessing protective relationships. So trauma does not cause negative health outcomes, risk factors. It is toxic stress. So it's when when exposure to trauma moves from tolerable into toxic stress that it causes negative health outcomes. So what we're trying to do in the workplace is prevent tolerable stress from turning into toxic stress. And that's why we need to intervene on that's how we intervene on secondary trauma, by building connection. So in our work with educators, our primary offering is we do a kind of an analogous presentation to them with this in a workshop on building culture of community care, but our primary offering is healing circles. So we bring educators together to connect, to make sure that their toxic stress is not, their tolerable stress is not moving into tolerable stress. And if folks have questions, because I'm saying a lot of things, you can drop them into the chat. And I'm gonna stop ranting in just a little bit, but I wanna make sure that we have this baseline understanding among us. And then what we've experienced during the pandemic is this sort of collective trauma that we're all experiencing together, a sense of ambiguous loss, like we've lost a lot of things, we don't know what it is, we've lost our sense of normal, and a lot of racialized trauma as well has risen to the surface. So none of these things are new, but the pandemic has really heightened our awareness of these things. And as a result, we're recognizing the need for healing. And I have this image underneath of these umbrellas because not everyone experiences these things in the same way because they have different resources. Some of us have weathered this storm with an umbrella. Some of us have weathered it with a summer house in Montauk. Some of us have weathered it with a poncho, and some of us have weathered it just like with nothing. So while we're experiencing this collective trauma together, our healing needs to be collective, but we have to recognize that people are experiencing it in different ways. I love a metaphor. Thank you, Lan, for affirming me. I appreciate that. And so because the trauma is happening at the collective level, the healing needs to happen at a collective level as well. So Dr. Sean Ginwright, who is really leading the work on healing-centered engagement, says that healing-centered engagement is akin to the South African term Ubuntu, meaning that humanness is found through our interdependence, collective engagement, and service to others. The healing-centered approach comes from the idea that people are not harmed in a vacuum, and well-being comes from participating in transforming the root causes of harm within institutions. So that's a big quote, and there's a lot there. And I've read it a bunch of times, so I'm like super familiar with it. But I want to give y'all a moment to just read it again to yourself and share in the chat any words or phrases in there that stick out to you. Transforming the root causes. Yep, Jennifer. Humanness. Yeah, it's buried in there, but yeah, thank you for pulling it out. It's a reminder of humanness, humanity again. So it's resonating with a bunch of folks. My brain just blended 3 words together. The emphasis on humanness being found through each other. It's not something we can create if we isolate ourselves. The vacuum, yeah, that always sticks out to me, that we're not harmed in a vacuum. Service to others, not harmed in a vacuum, prompting some connectivity to recent restorative justice initiatives in efforts, collective engagement, yep, interdependence. So I think, the Ubuntu is sometimes shortened to I am because we are. That we are sort of emphasizing the interconnectedness in humanity. And that's something that we've been robbed of during the pandemic. And also we weren't doing a great job of it before, right? So like, yes, the pandemic exacerbated these things, but we weren't really doing a great job of it before, participating in transforming rather than fixing. Yeah, thanks, Nadia. So keep that in your mind. Maybe take a picture of this slide, this concept of collective healing, and that's really what we're focusing on. This is something that I often say, is that to heal is to acknowledge that there was a wound in the first place. And I've heard the term healing thrown around a lot in recent months and years, because sometimes people are just jumping on the jargon bandwagon. But if we're really focused on healing, we're not just pushing yoga and I love yoga. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. Like, folks need that, but we're not just pushing kind of superficial initiatives. We are transforming at the root. We're acknowledging that there was a wound in the first place. And so much of the rhetoric in our country right now is that we can't talk about the wound, depending on where you are. We're lucky that in New York we can talk about it. And so I've been reflecting recently about how it's sort of a privilege to be able to talk about this so freely and openly, but we have to acknowledge it. And doing that in and of itself, and folks knowing that you as an organization are recognize the root causes and are trying to fix this issue at the root, and that you're acknowledging that there was harm done, can be healing in and of itself. And that brings us to this concept of community care. And so during the pandemic, I started to reflect a lot, because suddenly all of these workplaces were talking about self-care. And then it was followed by criticism of like, yeah, self-care, but like, are you giving us time for self-care? Self-care, but I'm actually taking care of a loved one. Self-care, but I don't actually have the privilege to do that. And Nikita Valerio said that shouting self-care at people who need community care is how we fail them. And the way that we define community care is that it's building in time and space to look at each other, connect, and support each other the way that we need to be supported. Self-care really puts the onus on the individual and doesn't consider our context. So the concept of community care is inclusive of self-care, but also acknowledges the context surrounding folks. And the next couple of slides sort of explain why this is, right? And how we can actually do this. This is something that I call this sort of like self-awareness stance, is that all day, every day, we need to be sort of aware of, you know, who it is that we're interacting with and where it is that we need to offer support. And in doing that self-awareness stance, we have to be aware of your privilege and proximity to power in each situation. So for example, right now, I'm the holder of this space. I'm leading it, right? Like, so I have a lot of power in this moment. In some spaces, I don't have a lot of power. So the person who holds power over me needs to do their own self-awareness stance and offer support to me, right? And so depending on our identity, depending on our position, depending on our role in a particular space, our role with regard to offering support to folks changes. And this is another model that kind of explains it, I think, a little bit more clearly. And Dr. Susan Silk has come up with what she calls the ring theory, is that comfort should be moving into the circle, and we should be dumping or venting out of the circle, right? So the person facing trauma is in the center, and then their close family, significant other, parents, their extended family and close friends are on the outer side and the outer circle, and then their like coworkers and friends are on the outermost circle. If we made this for the workplace, which this morning I was actually thinking I should make a workplace version of this, right? So the person who has a need would be here, then maybe their supervisor, then their supervisors, right? Or people on their, if it's within a team, then it's like, then this could change. It might not necessarily be based on power or position. It might just be that somebody has a need right now or is experiencing something. So the people who are closest to the problem need the most support, and everyone outside of that should be dumping support in, or should be pushing comfort in, and they can dump out to those folks. So this is kind of a model, and it requires a lot of self-awareness and reflection, right? It requires that dance for us to be thinking about, like, where am I in this ring right now? Who needs support, and who should I be leaning on for support, and who should I be supporting depending on what their needs are. So in order to do that, you have to really create space within your workplace for people to be able to express their needs. So what are the mechanisms that you have in place where folks can express what they need and can express how they need to be supported? If there's no way to collect that information, then and even if it's a conversation, it doesn't have to be a survey. It can just be a check-in, right? In the beginning of a meeting or in your one-on-ones, but you have to be able to understand what people need and have a culture where folks feel comfortable expressing what it is that they need. And people have to be willing to jump in and support as well, and trust that they're going to get support when their needs come up. Okay, so I've said a lot of things. I want you to do this activity in breakout rooms, actually. So I have this color wheel up here. I think that we can, like, Zoom has it so that you can actually share presentations in breakout rooms now, but I'm not sure. But just to be safe, I would love for you to take a picture of it, just in case you still need it when I take the slide down. But before we go into breakout rooms, I want you to choose 5 to 7 markers on the identity wheel that you choose to describe yourself. So don't just say age, but you could write your age, sexual orientation, you can share what it is, race, so you're filling in what that is, education, if it's, bachelor's degree or doctoral status, whatever it is. So choose 5 to 7 identity markers that you would like to use to describe yourself. And then I want you to choose 2 and reflect on the power, privilege, and positionality that identify them, that those identity markers afford you. And then you'll describe a scenario that demonstrates the above. So I'll kind of I'll give you an example of that. So my 5 would be my age. I'm in my mid-30s. I'm a Black cisgender woman. of Caribbean and West African lineage, first generation American, and I'm married. So if I was going to choose two of those to reflect on, the ones that give me power and privilege are being married, excuse me, and being in my mid-30s, so being someone who is seen in our society as being pretty young. And a scenario that affords me, that demonstrates that those afford me privilege are sort of the ways that people respond to me when I share that I just got married, or when I show up to meetings and people see my age, right? That they're not thinking about how long I'm going to be in a job. So that kind of shows my proximity to power. My age is something that I don't have to think about very often. I'm sort of at the age where people believe that I'm like competent enough to do something. They're not questioning that I'm too young, and they're also not questioning that I am too old either, right? So I'm at this kind of sweet spot with regard to my age, and it's something I don't think about a lot, and it affords me a lot of power and privilege. So that's going to be the activity. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to choose your identity markers, and then we're going to send you into breakout rooms of 3 to share your responses with some other folks in here. So I hope that y'all had enough time to have some conversation about the identity wheel. If folks could share in the chat, any aha moments or takeaways you had from your conversations, or anything you might like to share with the larger group. Good to connect. Always try to push connection. It's really important. Thanks for sharing, Gilda. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep us moving, but please feel free to share any takeaways you had from your conversations. But really, the reason I had you all do that is because in order to do this self-awareness dance, right, in order for us to figure out where we need to offer support and lend support, we need to be able to reflect on our own power and privilege, right? As in the same way that in the beginning, I asked you to reflect on your needs. So community care requires us to build in time and space to locate each other and connect and support each other the way that we need to be supported. And in a workplace, in order to do that, you have to have a practice where folks in the system reflect on their power, privilege, their identity, and their ability to support other people's needs. And also folks feel like they can communicate their needs. And there needs to be time, space, and I should also add resources for that work to happen. So if there's this culture of, take care of yourself, we're a family. And then it's like, but check email on weekends. And, if you need to take a day off, you're going to be made to feel guilty about it. Then are you really building in a structure for community care, right? So thinking about the infrastructure and how our workplace can create space for community care. So what we're going to talk about between now and the end of the session is how we can build this into a culture of community care. So these are 3 aspects of culture that Hofstede talks about in their research. And so there are 3 parts of culture using this framework. There's symbols, which are the pictures, the logos, the habits, the environments that are part of the fabric of the organization that signal what the organization is, what it feels like. The heroes, who are the people that set the example for behavior, and the rituals, or what are the recurring events that happen that shape our thinking unconsciously. I'll give some examples of symbols, right? So for example, symbols in our offices, and I don't know how many of y'all have gone back, could be who holds the window offices, right? Who works in cubicles versus who has access to light. Who has to, where folks sit within the office, like what their proximity to light and space is a big one. Logos, like what are the things that are in your logos? Do they signal a history of oppression in some way? Does your name signal a history of oppression in some way? Pictures, what are the pictures that are hung across your office? And what do they symbolize, and how do they indicate culture? What are the photos that are on your website? And sort of examining those things, right? Heroes are the people who set the example. So one example of this is like, are the folks that everyone's saying like, oh my gosh, John is so great. He leaves work late every day. He answers emails on weekends. Like, he is so dedicated to the cause. If the hero of your organization is someone who has no boundaries and is burning themselves out, then that sends a subconscious message to everyone that that's the way that we should operate if we want to be seen as someone who really cares about this work. Or is your hero someone who, you know, is a parent and makes time for their kids and puts on their calendar soccer game, takes off when their kid's sick, and still gets their work done even though they're doing it on their time? You know, who are the heroes of your organization, and how are you kind of sending these subconscious messages of what your culture is? And rituals. When someone's off for work, do you email them? Do you schedule do you put in the subject line, do not respond until you return from vacation? You know, what are the kind of habits within your workplace that indicate your culture? Or are folks in the beginning of every session, of every meeting, building in space to connect? Like I did at the beginning of this, that's a ritual of how we work at Healing Schools Project. We have a check-in at the beginning of every meeting. So what are the things within your organization that signal your culture and signal a culture of community care? In our remaining time, I want you to spend some time thinking about how we can build a culture of community care or co-care within our organizations. Sort of thinking about the symbols, the heroes, and the rituals in your workplace. And I'm going to leave you with a tool to do that reflection. But before you even start to think about that, think about yourself and think about what are the conditions you need to be true for you in order for you to feel like you're in a culture of community care, right? Where you feel like there's time for connection, you feel like there's time for healing, you feel seen and heard in your organization. And you can ask this question to everyone in your workplace. Ask them, like ask your direct reports, ask your teams, what are the conditions you need in order to feel supported here? What would you need in order to feel seen here? What would you need in order to feel valued here? And think about how we can shift culture to indicate that. And this framework of symbols, heroes, and rituals isn't perfect, but it's a good reflection. And where you're making the shifts, you're really wanting to focus in on the rituals. So the symbols and heroes are things that we can reflect on and change. Some of them are like deeply embedded into our organizational history. Some of them are like in our charters. Changing a name of an organization is really hard. Changing a logo is really hard. The heroes, I think, can be done, and it takes a bit more work, but those rituals are kind of where you can get some quick wins. Some of them might be larger projects, but those are the things that really need to be shifted in this moment. And in our work, we kind of use a framework. We have these 4 areas where we think about community care. We think about space for the settled body. So we think about, you know, what are the conditions that we need in order for us to bring our settled body into work so that we're not highly stressed in the workplace? What are the opportunities in our workplace to bring in space for rest? And I don't just mean sleeping, I mean like taking breaks, taking sensory rests, taking social rest, taking creative rest. So where is there space for rest in our workplace? Space to dream, space to think about doing things differently, to use our imaginations, and to remove the boundaries of what we think are the ways that we can do things. And then space for joy and celebration. So celebrating small wins, celebrating each other's successes, creating space for people to heal. I'm the board chair of an organization called Cohort Sisters that supports Black women pursuing doctoral studies. In the beginning of all of our board meetings, I ask all the other board members, like, what are some wins that you've had? And some of them are like, I got my wallet back when I lost in an Uber, and I'm so excited about that today. And some of them are, I got a research grant and I, have had 3 failed applications and finally won one. And some of them are big, right? So creating that space is really important. So those are the 4 areas that when we're working with schools, we work with them to help them incorporate space for these 4 areas. So feel free to use this framework. And then to close, I want to leave you with an opportunity to reflect on where your organization is currently with regard to community care. So if Adia, if you could share the link that I shared in the chat, you can either fill this out now. If I were you, I'd fill it out now since we have 5 minutes left and it's fresh in your mind. You can share it with your colleagues and begin to think about, what are the practices that you need in your community to have a culture of community care. And if you share your email address in the survey, I will email the results back to you so you can see them and you can share them with your folks. So with that, we've got about 4 minutes left for questions. Sorry that this was so quick. I really appreciate your time. I also want to share our information. So you can email me, wenimo@healingschoolsproject.com. That's our website. You can follow us on Twitter. We're on mainly Twitter and Instagram, but we're also on LinkedIn and Facebook. So that is our information. Thank you so much for having me, and really excited to learn about how you incorporate this work into your workplaces and with your organizations.
Thank you, Wenimo. And I will share the link out in the follow-up email as well with all the slides, so you folks can use the slides themselves and sort of begin these conversations at your own organizations. And in the last moment or two, if anybody has things they want to share that they've done or are doing in their organizations to create that culture, whether it's ritual or really thinking about the heroes or what we value. I know modeling is such a huge one, right? The folks in leadership positions really need to model the behavior of community care in order for it to feel safe and okay for others to do. But if others have examples they want to share.
I'm sure you're all doing things. I know it's true.
Yeah.
I always love to learn from other organizations about what they're doing too. Every time I do these, I learn. So please share in the chat or share afterwards, because it'd be really great to learn.
Yeah, let us know. This is a conversation that will continue, and I think I'll just end with saying never underestimate the small things. I know I've told some of the FPWA folks at a previous organization that I came from, we started something called PEG, the Positivity Penguin. It was literally a stuffed penguin that each staff meeting, which is every other week, one person passed it to another person and said what they appreciate about that individual. And at first I was like, this isn't going to fly. These are attorneys and advocates and serious people. They are not going to care about a stuffed penguin. But they did, and it has gone on for years, and people love it at all levels. And so I'll leave you with that of like, don't underestimate the power of small things too in creating a positive culture.
I think at CHLDC, like I mentioned earlier in the chat, we created a fun and wellness committee. I mean, we had a fun committee before that was in charge of parties, had like get-togethers, but now we incorporated the wellness piece. So I think that's a start. I think we have a lot to go in terms of building that culture of care. But I think we're on the right track.
Absolutely. We can do serious work and still be fun. It's true. Thank you, Gadi. All right, well, it's just about to switch to 11, so we'll let everyone go on time, but just thank you again to everyone for joining. Thank you especially to Wenimo for leading us through this conversation. I'm sure it's the first of many in this general arena. And have a wonderful Tuesday, everybody. Thanks for joining us.